Good morning. Welcome. My name is Meredith McGehee. I'm Executive Director of Issue 1. I have a bit of a cold, so excuse my husky voice, but I just didn't want to miss it this morning because I think this is such an important event, and it's really glad to see you here. I want to make sure and thank the Center for Responsive Politics for this lovely space, and thank you for hosting to Sheila and her team. I want to make sure everyone understands that this event is on the record and it is being live streamed, and everything that goes on here we're happy to share and talk about and answer questions. As we open it up for questions after you hear from our first two speakers, we will be passing the mic, so please make sure and wait for the mic to be in your hands. Identify yourself so those listening in on the live stream can have a clue what's going on. Let me just take 1 minute here to talk about why we are doing this event. We all know in the last election, dark money is playing an increasing role. I know that talking to members of Congress, whether they be Republican, Democrat, or Independent, one thing they all fear is dark money because it's money that they have a hard time anticipating, responding to, understanding. And it's really a big question for the American people, because when you don't know where the money is coming from, it's hard to do actually what the Supreme Court said you should be able to do as an American citizen, and that is to judge the message partly by who the messenger is. And that is something that many people forget, that is part of Citizens United and many, many other cases that the Supreme Court has upheld, that knowing both the message and the messenger is an important part of being an American citizen. So I'm really pleased today to have two panels. We're going to start with one with the experts in the field about how you start to get a handle on dark money. We have Anna Massolia, who is with the Center for Responsive Politics. As you see by the handy-dandy screens we have here, she is the Nonprofits and FARA researcher. And she's going to be talking about the research that CRP is doing on the issue of dark money. And then Mike Beckel, who is our research manager at Issue 1. Michael has a long career as a reporter and one of the experts of tracking data related to money and politics. So I'm going to turn it over to them right away and have them tell you a little bit about how you do this for the reporters in the audience especially. And then we'll have another panel after that to talk about what can be done. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Very much, Meredith, and thank you all for coming out today, and thank you to everyone watching us online on Facebook. My name is Michael Beckel, and I'm the research manager at Issue 1 here in Washington, D.C. I worked for about a decade as a reporter before joining Issue 1, including 3 years at the Center for Responsive Politics and 5 years at the Center for Public Integrity. And I'll be getting into a presentation in just a minute.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Massolia. As Meredith mentioned, I'm the Nonprofits and FARA researcher at the Center for Responsive Politics. What that means is a lot of my research focus is on dark money, politically active nonprofits, and other types of non-disclosing groups using IRS filings, Federal Communications Commission political ad filings, to some extent FEC filings, as well as Foreign Agent Registration Act filings and digital ad filings. And I'll also be presenting on how to track dark money today.
So again, thank you everyone for coming. All of the information that we're talking about here, we've got a nice little tip sheet for this part of the presentation at bit.ly dark money tips. Please check it out. But before we get started here, I just want to kind of define what we mean by dark money. So when I talk about dark money, when we talk about dark money, we really mean spending in U.S. elections by opaque organizations. And most of the dark money that we see in U.S. elections comes from three types of sources. We've got nonprofits that are organized under Section 501c4 of the tax code, which is the designation for groups whose primary purpose by design is supposed to be the promotion of social welfare. we've got nonprofits organized under Section 501c6 of the tax code, which is the designation for groups whose primary purpose is to be a business league or a chamber of commerce. And we also see some dark money from limited liability companies, LLCs in many states, especially Delaware, Wyoming. LLCs are essentially black boxes, and the public has very little idea who is actually behind those groups. And we've seen a surge of dark money in politics because of the U.S. Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. That ruling allowed companies, including these types of nonprofit companies, to spend unlimited amounts of money for or against candidates, supporting candidates, opposing candidates with TV ads, radio ads, all sorts of different types of expenditures. And as long as their primary purpose isn't influencing elections, they've basically resisted disclosing, telling us who their donors are. If their primary purpose was influencing elections, that's when they would register under a different section of the tax code, the Section 527, that would require them to disclose their donors with the FEC or the IRS or some other regulator. But we've really just seen an explosion of dark money since Citizens United. And for a project that Issue 1 published in September called Dark Money Illuminated, we looked at the top 15 dark money organizations, and we profiled all 15 of those organizations. These 15 groups alone accounted for 75% of all dark money spending between 2010, when the Citizens United ruling was handed down, and the 2016 election, and most of them were still active in the 2018 midterm election. So for each of these profiles, which is on our website at issue1.org/dark money, you can see some information about who is behind these groups, as well as who's connected to them, and some information about how they're spending the money that they've raised and what we could tell about the money that they raised. So we spent a year going through different types of public records, different data sources, to be able to say what we knew about the money coming into these groups. And we made all of that searchable, sortable, downloadable in a database on our website, which was also published with ProPublica. Here's a little screenshot. You can kind of see we've got a name of a donor. We classified each of the donors, so whether it was a labor union, a company, an individual, a 501c entity, some information about the money, when the donation occurred, the data source for each of these contributions that we found, and we also linked to primary source documents. You don't have to take our word that these groups are funding dark money organizations. You can see these primary source links for yourself on Document Cloud. So all of that's on our website at issue1.org. And this morning, I really want to talk through the main areas that we found most fruitful for looking for dark money in these obscure public records. So we've got filings with the Federal Election Commission. We've got filings that registered lobbyists need to file with Congress, which are called LD-203 filings. There's filings that labor unions submit on an annual basis to the Department of Labor, called LM2s. Nonprofits file annual reports each year with the IRS, called Form 990s, and the week that we're in right now, I know we all lived through the midterm election. Many nonprofits are actually filing new 990s later this week, you know, they can be a really fruitful thing to look into. And there's also been an increasing number of corporations that are voluntarily disclosing some information about the political groups that they give to, sometimes trade associations, sometimes other 501c3 or C4 entities. But all of those are completely voluntary, and we'll talk about each of those. So on the FEC's new recently redesigned website, fec.gov, searching expenditure data is extraordinarily easy. If you go to their spending database, you can search in their disbursement database by name. So here's a screenshot of one example where we typed in one of the 15 dark money groups. So the American Action Network was one of these groups. And you can see here immediately that there are some results in FEC data. So the American Action Network, like all of these dark money groups, does not disclose its donors. But if it receives money from a political committee, like the Congressional Leadership Fund Super PAC, or the Boeing Political Action Committee, or the United Technologies Political Action Committee, each of those PACs has to report that money as a disbursement. So we can see here through the disbursement data that, Boeing, for instance, has given $250,000 to the American Action Network that wouldn't be known otherwise. You can see here that the United Technologies company PAC also donated $50,000 earlier this year to the American Action Network. And sometimes there's great little details on the forms themselves. If you click on that little arrow on the far right side on the page, there's an option to see the original PDF image, and that's what is pulled up here on the right side of the screen. And this one says the American Action Network is a 501c4 organization. Makes it very clear what you're seeing, and that this is dark money that wouldn't be disclosed otherwise. The next thing I want to mention is the LD-203 filings. Registered lobbyists have to file twice a year with both the House and the Senate, redundant forms. The House and the Senate, however, make these forms slightly differently available in how you can search that data. So for finding dark money organizations, I prefer using the Senate data. As you can see here, they have different fields on both the House and the Senate side. And if you look at both the payee and the honoree field on search for a dark money group that you're interested in, you might find dark money intermingled with money, given to candidates, given to PACs, given to party committees. So here were a couple examples from our database. This is what those LD-203 filings look like. And, again, usually there's, scores of different contributions to political candidates and parties. The top example shows $20,000 to the Vote Vets Action Fund coming from a labor union. And the bottom example shows $50,000 to Crossroads GPS coming from an individual registered lobbyist. And again, these are contributions that we might not know otherwise, less, they disclosed it to Congress through these LD-203 filings. The LM2 filings that labor unions file with the Department of Labor have a nifty search online. And again, all the links to each of these searches are in the tip sheet, the bit.ly Dark Money Tips tip sheet. The labor union payer search here allows you to put the name of a group into this LM2 search, and you can see basically, did any labor union ever pay any money to any entity that you're searching? So we searched all our dark money groups through this database. I have to say this database is a little quirky, a little finicky for me. I get the best results when I also specify a fiscal year in addition to the name, meaning that you have to search multiple times for the same record. If you don't put in a fiscal year, sometimes you don't get records, even though you know that they're there when you search for a fiscal year. But here's an example of what those forms and results look like. So the first screenshot on the top here is a search result for Patriot Majority USA. And if you click on the left-hand side there where it says 2016 report or 2017 report, you'll open up the actual report, which is often hundreds of pages long. But you can very easily do, a search on the page and find the dark money group that you're listed here. And then, for instance, here's a $100,000 contribution from a major labor union to liberal dark money group Patriot Majority USA that we wouldn't have known about otherwise. So companies, as I said, are increasingly disclosing some information about the political groups that they're giving money to. Sometimes this is just trade associations. Sometimes it's a mix of trade associations and 501c4s or 501c3s. And because these are voluntary, there's no standard form, and companies can release them basically on whatever timetable they want in different forms. Here's a few examples where you've got Phillips 66 simply saying, here are a bunch of organizations that we paid at least $50,000 or more. The R.J. Reynolds example and Qualcomm example both get into the weeds a little bit more and say not only how much they contributed overall. In the case of Qualcomm, you can see exactly how much was given and how much was also given specifically for political purposes, the non-deductible portion for lobbying and political expenditures. And in the R.J. Reynolds case, they say that they're disclosing groups that they gave at least $50,000 to, and in some cases, it's very clear that they gave more than $50,000 because they disclosed the non-deductible portion, which in some cases was, 6 or 7 figures. So again, with each of these records, it's really like looking for needles in haystacks. You don't know what you're going to find until you look at the filings themselves, but sometimes you stumble across interesting things. And two organizations that have kind of put together some information about what companies have done this in the past. In addition to the database that we published at Issue 1 earlier this year, the Center for Public Integrity did a project a few years back that I was a part of that looked at companies that disclosed this type of giving in 2012. And since 2015, the Center for Political Accountability has also been tracking this information, disclosing this information, making it easy for people to search on a website called trackyourcompany.org to see if these companies disclose to different entities, including 501c4 or 501c6 groups. Last but not least, I want to talk about the IRS Form 990s. These are some of the most valuable documents that are out there in the public record for tracking money to dark money organizations. There's a lot of different places out there to get 990s from. Again, these are public records that any group would have to give you if you requested from them, and you can also use groups like the Foundation Center or ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer or citizenaudit.org to find these records online. I want to talk briefly about citizenaudit.org just because it's such a powerful tool for following money between nonprofits and following dark money in politics. When we did our project, citizenaudit.org allows you to search for a name, a phrase, a number, put it in quotes, do different searches across all Form 990s that they have in their databases. So when we did our work, we searched for the exact name, we searched for partial names of the dark money groups that we were looking for, we searched for the 9-digit EIN numbers that these groups have, we searched for 7-digit EIN numbers that they have, because sometimes these forms which are filled out, it's easier to find it with the dash, without the dash, this kind of stuff. And so you can see here are a couple of examples of money, flowing to the liberal dark money group Majority Forward or the conservative dark money group Crossroads GPS, and just based on those searches of the EIN numbers, you're finding all sorts of connections that you wouldn't have seen had you not been able to search in such an easy manner. So citizenaudit.org is a hugely powerful tool for that, and the bottom screenshot just shows what one of these actual forms looks like. When you open up the 990, you want to go down to the Schedule I to see information about these groups. And last but not least, since many of the dark money groups that you're interested in might also be 501c entities themselves, getting their 990s can also be fruitful and illuminating. So here's an example, a recent example from Majority Forward. The first page of that 990 says things such as how much money they raised, how much money they spent. The Schedule Bs that get released, even when they redact the actual names of each donors, do show the amounts of each donation coming in. So here in this example, there's a $14 million contribution to Majority Forward from a single unknown source, which if you do some simple math, 14 million is about 40% of 34 million. So you can kind of see that one donor is accounting for the bulk of the money going into this group. Other parts of the 990s also show things like what political spending they're self-reporting to the IRS on Schedule C. There's also information about which independent contractors they're paying the most how much they're paying their own staff, and all of that could be helpful as you background any of these 501c4s that are active in the 2020 presidential cycle. So thank you very much again. And again, the tip sheet is at the bit.ly link /darkmoneytips, and I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Michael. Michael covered a lot of ground here with the 990s and the Lobbying Disclosure Act forms and all of that. So I'm going to cover a few other ways that you can also track dark money using other different types of public disclosures and resources that are available. Do we just switch? Sorry. All right, so to kind of just go over the basics, I know we already kind of covered a little bit of what dark money is. Dark money is funding from anonymous sources that influences politics. At Open Secrets, we track not only dark money that's flowing into elections at the federal level, but also dark money that's flowing into other types of politics, whether that be nominations for different federal positions or for the Supreme Court. Just this year, we saw a lot of money flowing into the Supreme Court nomination, obviously. And going into 2020, we're expecting to see a lot of money flowing into various elections at that point. Already, we're seeing a lot of money behind various groups. And so we're going to go into a little bit about how to best track that. During the 2018 elections, we saw an exceptional amount of dark money totaling over 98 million, and that's still coming in with just the FEC reported filings. In addition to what's reported to the FEC, there's also a lot that doesn't actually show up there, which I'll go into a little bit more depth about as I go into the presentation, but already just nearing 100 million in just the disclosed numbers at this point. And dark money groups have reported spending more than 750 million since 2010, which is the year that Citizens United was decided, which is one of the key dark money cases that really opened the doors to that. And we've continued tracking it since then. So going into the different types of dark money, I know Michael kind of covered this, but to go into a little bit more depth about the different types of 501c3s. 501c4 groups, as Michael mentioned, are the social welfare nonprofits, which are one of the key players in terms of what would be tracked with various tax returns, that type of thing, and probably one of the most common reporting spenders that you're seeing. These groups can engage in political activities, but it can't be their primary purpose, unlike 501c3s, which are more of the charitable nonprofits, which are technically not allowed to do any politicking, but are allowed some type of get-out-the-vote efforts or voter registration efforts, which we have seen a decent amount of in recent years. Those are not allowed to be explicitly partisan, but in some cases, groups find ways to skirt those rules and target their voter registration in certain areas, benefiting certain parties, that types of things. So we do see some extent there, but we don't necessarily track that as much at Open Secrets. That said, you can still get their tax returns outside of that. And some 501c4s that do have affiliated 501c3 arms, so that they both have two different related entities, oftentimes with similar names, we sometimes do include in our system since they oftentimes can serve as extensions of the different groups. Just to briefly go over the other types of 501c3 organizations that would have 990s that we track are the 501c5s, which are kind of labor and agricultural groups, and the 501c6 business leagues, chambers of commerce, real estate, and trade groups. While there are a lot of different divisions, the groups are not necessarily what their names always suggest. For instance, some dark money groups that effectively operate as partisan political operations may consider themselves to be a chamber of commerce, even though they have very little in common with a chamber of commerce, no employees, and no real function other than spending in politics, whereas others may actually function in that case, which is why really getting into the specifics, looking through the different returns of activities the groups are spending on, that type of thing is so important. A few other types of dark money, and this list is by no means comprehensive, since dark money groups are continuing to find new ways to skirt rules and new ways to, I guess, get their money in politics, would be the super PACs masking funding sources with donations from dark money groups. Often, although super PACs are required to disclose their donors, they're not restricted in taking money from 501c4s or other non-disclosing entities. And although they would disclose that group, they wouldn't necessarily be disclosing the ultimate source of funding or really much about who the ultimate donor is anyways. You'll also in some cases see limited liability companies or shell companies as the reported donors there, or in sometimes spending directly in politics, which is something we've seen a bit more of recently. And then you also have non-entities, which I know is a very weird and somewhat ambiguous category, but it's something new that we've only recently started tracking. And this can take a few different forms. One of the main ways we've seen this year is through digital ad spending, where a group or non-entity necessarily will pop up, spend thousands and thousands of dollars, and in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars, I would assume, on Facebook ads, on Google ads, on Twitter ads, and with explicitly political messages in some cases, including calls for vote for and vote against, in something that is not necessarily regulated by the FEC. We're seeing groups that don't necessarily have physical addresses in this case and have a lot of the same aspects of a dark money group, but have even less of a paper trail than the traditional groups would have. And in this case, it's much harder to track. Only recently with digital ad disclosures and have we been able to track these groups at all. And I'll go into a little bit more depth about those later on, but that's kind of one of the key ways, one of the key types. Another type that we've seen more recently is fiscal sponsorship schemes. While there are a lot of legitimate reasons to have a fiscal sponsor for different nonprofits that are trying to seek tax-exempt status, who are trying to receive donations before they've received that, some groups will utilize this type of scheme to create a number of different non-entities that are technically subsidiaries of a larger group that don't have to file independent tax returns, have their own incorporation documents, or really any substantial records despite having independent names, operating for entirely independent purposes, having independent existences otherwise, independent FCC records, FEC records, but don't actually file independent paperwork, which makes who is ultimately behind them a lot harder to track, and also whether they're actually complying with the percentages for political spending, harder to track, since oftentimes the umbrella organization is a 501c4. Since the kind of the de facto rule for that, as mentioned above here, is the 49.9% of overall expenditures can't really be anything above that, can't be political, since it cannot be the primary purpose of the organization. Compiling a number of different, both legitimate as well as very highly politicized 501c4, potential 501c4 non-entities together into one big tax return as a way to kind of water down that political spending with even less disclosure, where it appears that the group is actually able to counterbalance that. But I'll go into that a bit more later, but those are just a few of the key types of dark money that we've been seeing a lot of over the past election cycle. Some of the benefits of being a 501c4 in its face are that you can operate without incurring a tax liability, that you can disguise the nature of the highly political organization through non-disclosure, and that you can take donations from individuals, corporations that don't necessarily want their shareholders or customers to know. In many cases, even though the public doesn't know, the customers don't know, the close ties between organizations and candidates or nominees, that type of thing, makes it appear that other people may be more privy than the general public would be. And that's one of the bigger issues with not having that widespread disclosure. And oftentimes these groups don't have to disclose anything until long after the activities have taken place, if at all. One of the ways that I mentioned earlier that groups can avoid disclosure is kind of watering down their spending, since they are limited with the percentage that they're able to spend on politics. One of the more traditional models of doing this is through grant giving between different 501c4 organizations, LLCs, that type of thing. And we have a handy chart up here that we created, kind of looking at dark money alchemy and how an initial $10 million spending can be funneled through a variety of different groups and go in and then come out looking like the groups are actually engaged in more legitimate spending to counteract their political spending, so that it doesn't look like their primary purpose is actually politicking. This is one of the key ways that groups will do this, and why you'll oftentimes see networks of dark money groups. Since these grants are considered part of the organization's primary purpose expenditures, they wouldn't be political even if the grant goes to a group that ultimately uses that money for political purposes. And so the recipient's organization's overall budget grows larger, and it allows it to spend more money on political activity. One of the things that this kind of is equated to this election cycle, but not necessarily the same, is the non-entities that I mentioned earlier, where you wouldn't necessarily see any of this in the disclosures since it is all considered one group, but would ultimately have the same effect of watering down the political spending with other activities. So there's a number of different sources that we use to track dark money. Here's Michael went over a lot of them earlier, but a few of the other key ones that we'll use, because there is no end-all be-all, no one-stop shop for finding dark money information, would be the Federal Election Commission, which is more generally the campaign finance disclosures, but are oftentimes very limited. The Internal Revenue Service, which has a lot of different types of tax disclosures, some of which we went over earlier and some of which I'll go into more depth later. The Federal Communications Commission, which has political ad filings for groups that are actually running broadcast ads on TV, radio, that type of thing. And then not really going in any depth with this, but the Foreign Agent Registration Act is another thing that we'll also track for more of kind of the international money coming in that comes in legally, but oftentimes can be routed through different types of LLCs, nonprofits, that type of thing. But I won't really get into too much depth there since most of the focus today is going to be domestic. So going into just the general reason that the FEC rules on their own are not necessarily sufficient, groups will often use different types of loopholes for web ads, mailers, and even TV ads in many cases. Issue advocacy is one of the big ways that dark money groups will try to skirt these disclosure rules, as long as you avoid the magic words of vote for, vote against, so-and-so for candidate, that type of thing, and avoid the window within 30 to 60 days of elections, varying on what type of election it is. You're able to not disclose at all to the FEC, and even if you do include those things, the disclosure requirements are limited in terms of with Electioneering Commission, which do avoid the words, you wouldn't have to disclose your donors, and with independent expenditures, it's a little more complicated, but ultimately can still have that same effect. The picture up here is an example of an actual ad that would be considered issue advocacy that uses words, let's fire Kay Hagan, which is not actually considered election not considered an independent expenditure because it doesn't use those magic words. Independent expenditures would have to have that explicit name. And again, that doesn't apply to digital ads. So at this time, the FEC is still undergoing a lot of consideration of this issue, but at this time, it does not appear that digital ads would have to fall under those disclosures either. So one other thing we've also seen in terms of shortcomings of where it becomes more difficult to track with FEC filings alone is through partially disclosing groups. One of the things I mentioned earlier was the super PACs that disclose dark money donors, and where they'll appear that they are disclosing groups, but the ultimate source of funding is still hidden. This election cycle in particular, there's been record spending by partially disclosing groups. They give the appearance of disclosing their donors in that way. They've spent over $405 million in spending just reported to the FEC, and we're basing that on groups that are disclosing either dark money as their donors or who are only partially disclosing their donors to the FEC. So that could be groups like super PACs or nonprofits that partially disclose their donors. In this case, one of the biggest groups was spending on House races and was indeed a super PAC that had a 501c4 as its donor. And this is the third consecutive election cycle that the portion of outside spending made up by partially disclosing groups has more than doubled based on FEC filings. And groups that don't fully disclose their donors have made up more than 50% of the outside spending reported to the FEC this year, which is substantial. And that includes both dark money as well as the partially disclosing, which would be the don't fully disclose. So more groups don't disclose their donors or don't disclose all of their donors than those that do at this point. Under the FEC earlier this year issued some new guidance. It's currently still undergoing an ongoing process of clarifying and creating actual rules required under it. But effectively, independent expenditures, which earlier on only required disclosure of donors that explicitly earmarked their contributions for those independent expenditures, according to some groups, are now required to disclose all donors that gave at least $200, quote, for political purposes during the calendar year or that were earmarked for independent expenditures or political purposes. That should be on there as well. So while that seems like a really great thing in theory, and it seems like if a group is spending on politics to the general reader that that would mean all of their donors. That has not really meant what it has been in actuality. We've already seen a lot of groups in the most recent filings for the final quarterly filings for the Federal Election Commission trying not to disclose their donors. One of the notations that we're seeing pretty commonly that we have seen in the past is that the groups will now, as a matter of policy, not accept funding for political purposes, despite spending tens of millions of dollars on that. In this case, this is an actual example of one of the notes that's pretty commonly used among a few different groups this year by Majority Forward, which was the top spending non-disclosing group this election cycle, which spent, last I count, over 30 million on independent expenditures alone this cycle that were reported to the FEC, and I'm sure it ended up totaling even more than that. And so that's why one of the main reasons that at this time, just looking at FEC data, while very important, alone doesn't provide a very complete picture of dark money, which is why tax documents are one of the things that we've really used in the past as kind of our bread and butter of this. The annual Form 990 tax returns are really important. That said, they're not disclosed until very late on in the game, around 5 to 10.5 months after the organization's fiscal year. The application status materials, which we really didn't disclose talk about as much earlier, are the Form 1024 for most of the groups, the 501c4s and the other groups, or the Form 1023 for 501c3 nonprofits. These can include all of the materials that organizations submitted to the IRS when they were pursuing tax-exempt status. That said, this only applies to groups that have actually pursued tax-exempt status with the IRS. One of the bigger loopholes to this is that the IRS allows 501c4 nonprofit organizations to self-declare themselves 501c4s so that they can act as 501c4 nonprofits without actually filing application materials. In this case, the group would file something called a Form 8976 notice. This is to notify the IRS within 60 days of when the organization is formed that they are going to act as a 501c4. In some cases, these groups do ultimately pursue tax-exempt status, but sometimes they do not. And the materials for that, for tax-exempt status, the 1024, 1023, aren't public knowledge until they've actually been approved for tax-exempt status. And the unfortunate thing about the Form 8976 is that it is a notice, not an application, which is treated differently under the Treasury regulations, which means it's not subject to public disclosure. So you can't actually request that from the groups. One of the big resources, and I know I'm actually running a little low on time, that we have is darkmoney.org. You can go through here and you can actually search for all of the 990s going through 2016 right now for politically active nonprofits with the ability to search and filter and a lot of other fun things, as well as kind of just a brief guide of that. We are, as of this week, going around and we're going to be collecting 990s for the last year and this year, and so we're going to continue to be updating and expanding that database, as well as submitting forms to the IRS to request that, as well as groups directly. Just to really quickly go through FCC Political Ad Files. We also collect FCC Political Ad Files, which are what different television stations, radio stations, and other broadcasters file with the Federal Communications Commission. This could be pretty much any type of ad that you're seeing on TV or hearing on the radio will generally show up in here. Only recently did the FCC, make all of these available online. That said, their system is still very hard to use, varied, and you have to actually search by station in many cases, that type of thing, which can be hard to track down. We've taken all of the political files, we've extracted the text, so you can now do a full text search of all political files that are running all over the country for key terms, as well as for different group names, candidate names, addresses, that type of thing, which is a really useful way of finding different information about dark money groups. And we've put all of that into one place that makes it searchable. The picture here is a heat map of where those ads are kind of running across the country. And we've extracted more than 3.8 million documents as of this date. That includes contracts, invoices, correspondence, and various other correspondence with stations, which can sometimes be pretty interesting. And we're parsing that and updating that daily with a full text search. Just to give you a couple examples of what those filings look like, these would be kind of the contracts and invoices, which really aren't very standardized, but you can calculate totals from. It's a lot of work, but currently the most up-to-date system for getting spending information from some groups. You'll see the information on NEB filings, I would go into a bit more depth, but I know I'm now at my time. I apologize. But you can find more information about board members, about addresses that may not show up in other filings, and put all of those together. Just to very quickly go over digital ad data, there's a few other sources of digital ad data that we've started exploring that are still very new that we don't have on our site yet, but we are exploring more internally would be Facebook, Google, and Twitter. This is kind of going back to those non-entities that I mentioned earlier, where you can just spend thousands of dollars on digital ads run by pages with innocuous sounding names and no one ultimately tied to them due to some disclosure rules. For example, the Facebook, while they require that ad buyers prove that they are in America, you can ultimately just hire an ad buyer to do that in many cases. And in some cases, it seems the groups do that. That's pretty much it for me. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Again, just to echo what Anna and I both said, we see dark money groups, dark money flowing into this process from both liberal and conservative sources. And in 2020, we will be reaching this milestone where $1 billion will have been spent by dark money groups and Citizens United. And I think with that, we're going to start taking questions.
Yeah, so we're going to open it up for questions. I just do want to remind folks, if you do look up the language about a 501c4, because we talked about primary purpose here, the actual statutory language says operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. So let's just remember what the statutory language is. All right, questions? Yes, sir. And there's a mic right here.
Anna, real quickly, when you were talking about Form 8976, that's where they can just simply declare themselves as a 501c4, but that's not disclosable?
At this time, that's correct, yes. So if you try to request a 1024, 1023, or I guess a 1024 generally, since it only applies to 501c4s, not C3s. If you do request that and the group says they filed that, they don't really have to give you anything. That said, their 990s are still publicly disclosable. You would just have to wait for their first 990 at that point.
And then quickly for Michael, when you were talking about the corporate filings that show up and you showed some examples, were those in SEC filings or were they simply press releases from the companies or what?
All of these voluntary corporate filings are voluntary. They are not filed with the SEC. They often live on different parts of the company's websites, whether that's investors relations, corporate responsibility, social responsibility, some of those buzzwords. So sometimes just through Googling, you're able to find those on the company's websites in whatever section they decide to publish them in.
Thanks for doing this. Really intrigued on the non-entities. So is it just that they are showing up on digital spaces or are they showing up other places? And can you talk a little bit about, is there any push right now from the FEC or for anybody to figure out who's behind these groups? Thanks.
There are different, I guess, forms of non-entities, since it's kind of just a colloquial term we're using right now, since there's a lot of different manifestations we've seen of that. The digital ads are a very key part of that, but in terms of the fiscal sponsorship schemes that I had mentioned, where it is non-entities under an umbrella group of that's a 501c4, but that they don't have separate incorporation documents, tax returns, or anything, that does go beyond just digital ad spending. We've seen those groups show up in FCC political ad filings as well. There was a lot of spending on the Supreme Court nomination being probably the most recent example, but I'm sure there's been election spending as well, but that was multi-million, so that comes to mind. But that's probably the only good way at this point to really track those. Some of the groups show up as trade names in their umbrella organizations' incorporation documents, but it's not really standard how they disclose them. So at this point, you would have to go to a specific state incorporation records, check if a group has updated their trade names, or check their 990, since sometimes they don't show up as trade names, sometimes they just put them in the following 990 as a DBA. So there really isn't a standardized disclosure, but it does go beyond digital ads to TV and radio ads as well. And the FCC data, the digital ad data, are probably the best way to track that at this point.
Yes, sir.
Is there any grounds for public interest groups to challenge?
Hold on, we need a mic.
Oh,
you could identify so that the live stream can know.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Alan Zibble with Public Citizen. Is there any grounds for public interest groups to potentially challenge the dark money groups that are really pretty closely tied with the Senate and House leaderships? And I can't remember which one is which, but like there's Senate Majority PAC, there's Majority Forward, there's Congressional Leadership Fund, that, you know, their claim to being social welfare organizations seems thin. Tenuous.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to offer legal advice. There will be several lawyers on our second panel who hopefully will get into some of that. But I mean, I think one of the things that I've heard from different lawyers that I've talked to over the years is this notion that private benefit, and to whatever extent that they are, as a 501c4, needing to operate for the promotion of social welfare and not to the private benefit of any individual, and whether or not that could be extended to mean the private benefit of one particular party over another political party. I think that's the general philosophy that would come into those kind of grounds. Clearly, you know, for a number of decades, there's been politically active nonprofits that generally work to, as Anna alluded to earlier, get out the vote on one side or the other, perhaps a little bit more, support liberal candidates or conservative candidates a little bit more. But that's what comes to mind.
Back in, hi, I'm Richard Skinner. I'm with Johns Hopkins University, the Coalition for Integrity, and who knows what else. But back in 2015, I conducted a series of convenings on dark money issues at the Sunlight Foundation. And one of the issues that kept coming up was this fear of what people called a disclosure cliff, that as politics moves away from television and moves online, that we're going to start losing a lot more information about ad spending. And I'm wondering, how serious is this problem? And now, 3 years after people started using the term disclosure cliff, are we over that cliff? Are we really losing a lot of information about who's funding our politics?
I mean, first and foremost, you know, when you are any entity, a super PAC, a dark money group, if you are spending money to expressly advocate for the election or defeat of that candidate, that needs to get reported to the FEC. So on the one hand, we've always got that type of spending that we can track and that we can see, and that's why we know that nearly $1 billion has been spent since Citizens United by dark money groups. I think there are plenty of efforts underway and discussions underway right now about how some of these digital advertising rules can be updated to the 21st century to say, you know, when some of these communications rules were created, the internet didn't exist, you know, TV didn't even exist in the, you know, the form that it does today. So I think that there are a lot of active conversations happening both at the FEC and in Congress about some of those issues.
I guess I see kind of a dichotomy there, that there, in one perspective, you have more disclosure now than ever with a lot of even agencies putting their data available online. You have the push at the FCC now to put their data online. You have e-filing with the Senate now, that type of thing. You have even, I guess, digital platforms and social media groups putting their ads online, because we really don't know how much they spent in prior election cycles until May of this year. On the other hand, it's not a perfect system yet, and you're also seeing groups continuing to get smarter with how they're skirting those disclosure rules. And I think that there's kind of a struggle there between the push for just more and more disclosure and putting that available online, and groups continuing to get smarter. And I think it's going to be a matter of which is faster, and I don't know if I'm the most optimistic there.
And I'll just note that we're going to be talking about that more in the second panel. Yes.
Hi, Stephanie Aiken from CQ and Roll Call. I just have a technical question. You guys both mentioned darkmoney.org for searching 990s. Are you missing anything if you use that versus paying for GuideStar?
We are currently in the process of updating it. We don't have last year and this year, but we are getting those as of the upcoming months. We're planning to update and do a big release. Right now, I would say ProPublica is very good as well, as is GuideStar, but we had partnered with GuideStar through 2016, so up through 2016, that is entirely as comprehensive as GuideStar.
Thanks.
And just to chime in also on that, I think the ProPublica database and their nonprofit explorer, they're getting the bulk files that they're processing, the 990s, and citizenoaudit.org. I really can't stress enough how awesome of a search tool that is for 990s.
Yes, sir.
My name is Bobby Littman. I'm with democracyisnotforsale.org. In a recent local election, one candidate received a lot of money from LLCs. And that became, I believe, a pivotal voting issue, where 60% of the voters believing that special interest money had a quid pro quo relationship with votes of the county council. Is there any organizations that are focusing on helping candidates communicate to voters that they should be rejecting candidates that take such dark money?
We certainly know that while our organizations are mostly focused at the federal level, that all of the trends that we're seeing in dark money trickle down to state and local and municipal elections. I know we fielded calls from reporters tracking dark money in county level races, municipal races. So everything that we see at the federal level trickles down to local elections. I think there's a number of groups, some more federally focused, some more state focused, that are active in that kind of area. You've got Represent.us, you've got Take Back Our Republic, you've got End Citizens United. There's another research organization based in Montana called the National Institute on Money in Politics, previously known as the National Institute on Money in State Politics, that recently merged with the Campaign Finance Institute. So they do track a lot more state and state level spending at their website, followthemoney.org. So those are a few things.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Hold on one second.
Ken Doyle from Bloomberg Government. Do you, from the sources that you are able to look at and sort of deduct what's going on, how would you characterize, what do you know about the sources of dark money? I mean, you don't know zero, right? There's some things that you've been able to figure out.
Right. I mean, I think the gist of the project that we did with the Dark Money Illuminated project, we spent a year poring over obscure public records, and we were able to identify about one of every $9 flowing into these dark money groups. And so that was coming from a host of labor unions, trade associations, some of these 501c entities that have acted as sort of financial hubs for various donor networks. At the end of the day, most dark money is still dark, and in some of the examples we found, we identified opaque organizations giving to another opaque organization, raising a lot of questions about what can be done, and I think the second panel is going to talk a lot more about that issue.
Yeah. You can't really put your finger on a particular source that's more important than others. One of the questions that I've had is whether it's corporate money that is corporations, big corporations that are shy about having their names known, being involved in partisan politics and so on. But I've had people say that that's not really it. It seems to me like just logically it's got to be somebody who might be recognized and doesn't want to be, right? Is that not right? Or
I mean, what we know from our analysis was that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for instance, was the #1 dark money spender since Citizens United, accounting for about one of every $6 spent in dark money. Right. Which corporations are driving that spending is unknown. At the end of the day, we can only count what we can see. And it's in many cases up to individual companies or individual donors to come forward to brag about this type of giving. And if they don't want that publicly known, it's very difficult to count. So I think our best guess is that it has to be a mix of corporate entities, individual entities, labor unions, whatever vehicle they channel
Do you
that
think
money
the
through.
beneficiaries of it know who they are? Know who the sources are?
I think in some cases it's rather clear that the beneficiaries have some idea who is spending that money. Do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I think one of the issues we've seen, at least with the self-disclosure, is it's hard to track how comprehensive it is, since the disclosure level by different companies is across the board just very different, and both in terms of methodology as well as how reliable it is. But you're also seeing individual donors dealing with stigma attached to certain candidates or certain issues, as well as companies. It's extremely hard to track to an ultimate source. We probably have a lot more information about the political operatives who are involved in different networks, the friends of who the ultimate donors are, than we do the donors themselves. And probably the most reliable source for that is the Schedule B, despite the fact that we don't get the names. Really matching those amounts with grants that are disclosed to 990s is still almost seems archaic at this point, but the best bet at actually being able to track that, unless a donor name is accidentally leaked with a 990, which does happen in some cases.
Well, I want to thank our stars here. For any of you that have further questions, they will be available, but we hope you'll stay for our second panel, where we're going to discuss the solutions and answer some of the questions that were raised. Again, thank you to CRP. If you have further questions about what Issue 1 is doing, what CRP is doing, or if you really have more detailed data questions, they'll both be available to talk to you. So we're going to take just a few minutes break to set up the table for our next panel, and we hope you'll stick around, and we'll be talking about what we can do about this situation. Thank you. Hello? There we go. All right. Hello again. Again, I'm Meredith McGeehee, the Executive Director of Issue 1. We're an organization that is working to bring Democrats, Republicans, and independents together in the movement for political reform. And I'm pleased to be joined by several colleagues that are experts in the area of money and politics, especially in terms of how Washington works. And I want to make sure and spend most of our time having them talk, but we want to talk today a little bit about what are some of the things that can be done about dark money, given where we are in terms of the law and the regulation. So joining me today are Adav Noti with the Campaign Legal Center, Sheila is with the Center for Responsive Politics, which of course is our host today, and Tyler Cole, who is with Issue 1. So I'm going to turn it over quickly to them. We've asked them in each case to talk about a specific area of dark money, and we want to make sure that we also leave time for your questions. This is being streamed again on Facebook. It's live. Everything is on the record, and we want to make sure that we leave some time here for people to ask questions. So Adav, you're going next.
Thanks, Meredith, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. So I think it's a little bit hard to talk about dark money now and solutions without talking about, at least a little bit, recapping how we got here, how we got to this point in the dark money saga. So in 2010, as everybody knows, the Supreme Court ruled in its Citizens United decision that corporations have a right to spend money in elections. And that opened up this new category of spending that had been illegal in the United States for 100 years, corporate spending in elections. Now, there were, at the time, and there still are, laws on the books that required disclosure of that spending, that required entities that engage in independent spending to publicly disclose where they got the money to engage in that spending. So after the Citizens United decision, the Federal Election Commission, which is the government agency that applies the law to new factual situations, had to decide how to apply that existing disclosure law to this new category of spending that had never existed before. Rather than just apply it and say, okay, now corporations who are allowed to engage in this spending may do so and shall disclose like everybody else does, the FEC took the position that it was unfair to these new spenders to subject them to the same rules that everybody else had to follow, because when the disclosure laws were written, this sort of spending wasn't contemplated, it wasn't allowed. And so the FEC said, well, these disclosure laws aren't a good fit for this new category of spending. And the FEC created a new disclosure rule, which was extremely narrow. So narrow that as a practical matter, no funding of independent spending by corporations was truly disclosed from that time forward. And in addition to promulgating that rule, the FEC in the enforcement context, when people would complain formally about lack of disclosure, the FEC took the position that it wouldn't be fair to require disclosure from those entities. They didn't have notice that there was going to be disclosure, and so the FEC declined to enforce the law against non-disclosing corporate spenders. So you ended up with a situation where all sorts of corporate entities, 501c4s, LLCs, sometimes for-profit corporations, but that's a little less common, were engaging in election spending without disclosing where they got the money, and of course, that is dark money. So the one thing I really want to stress today is that dark money, the problem of dark money, although it gets conflated with Citizens United pretty frequently, is not a creation of the Supreme Court. It's not a creation of Congress. It's a creation of the Federal Election Commission. Dark money is a creation of the FEC. Now, in terms of solving the problem, that's sort of a double-edged sword. The fact that the FEC created dark money means that you don't need to overturn Citizens United to fix it. You don't need new constitutional holdings. It's perfectly constitutional to require disclosure in this context. And you don't need an act of Congress. All you need is action by the Federal Election Commission. The bad news there is that you need action by the Federal Election Commission. And it's abundantly clear that that is not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen, at least not as the FEC is currently constituted. Where you used to work? Where I spent quite a bit of time before I came to the Campaign Legal Center. So the FEC isn't going to fix it. So the question then is, who is? Congress could take the decision out of the FEC's hands and mandate, arguably the laws are already on the books that are necessary, but Congress could take the decision out of the FEC's discretionary docket and make it mandatory. And there are, I think Tyler's going to talk about some of the ideas for that that have already been introduced, and my organization, the Campaign Legal Center, has some legislative ideas along those lines. Or the courts could fix it. The courts could order the FEC to follow the existing laws and mandate disclosure. One court here in DC has already done that. The very narrow rule that the FEC promulgated that I mentioned earlier was struck down by a federal court here in DC not long ago for being contrary to the agency's statutory mandate. There's been, that decision at the time got a lot of attention. It was portrayed in some circles as solving dark money. It didn't, it won't. All it did was take away this one unbelievably glaring loophole that the FEC had created to allow disclosure to be hidden. But any moderately competent campaign finance lawyer in the current environment can drive a truck through the remaining loopholes. It's as simple as setting up an LLC and running your money through an LLC, which at least half of the FEC's commissioners have taken the position that that is lawful and does not require further disclosure. So the courts may intervene at some point, Congress may intervene at some point. Otherwise, we will see what the FEC does.
Sheila?
Hello. Thanks so much for inviting me to join you today, and thanks for being here. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the IRS, but before that, I do that, I want to just review what CRP is doing about in this space. We are not an advocacy organization, primarily. We are a research organization. We started investigating dark money after Citizens United, gathering data from IRS tax forms, other sources, tracking grants unearthed on Form 990 Schedule I's, and reporting how the money flows to and churns through networks of organizations, some transparent, some partially disclosing, and some disclosing neither sources nor how it is spent. And after 8 years of study of the problem of dark money, we believe the need for access to this information is so fundamental because, according to the hydraulic theory of money in politics, money will find a way around obstacles when alternatives exist. And dark money is the most active and attractive alternative channel because IRS rules are so vague and oversight is so weak. And that's because nonprofits and LLCs were never supposed to become a major channel for political money. The IRS has long been hounded by lawmakers who decry IRS audits as partisan. And following the so-called Tea Party scandal of 2013, conservative distrust of the IRS ability to enforce the rules fairly has only grown. More fundamentally, the IRS is not a disclosure or political regulation agency. It's an agency charged with keeping personal data private. And the more appropriate oversight body would be the FEC, in theory. Finally, the IRS own rules offer no clear guidance to nonprofits about how much political activity is too much, but instead enforce tax-exempt rules based on facts and circumstances tests, meaning they'll know it when they see it. Vague rules and ineffective oversight make it easy for such groups to spend heavily in elections without being required to disclose their donors. So far, we've seen little progress. Despite justifying the Citizens United decision in part on adequate disclosure, political leadership to ensure it has given way to partisan bickering and opportunism. And because the IRS is not a political regulatory agency, the job of using the data as an enforcement tool, as the FEC does, hasn't been developed. So, in light of this, we have argued that the IRS should do three things. Develop that bright line test to more clearly define and convey the exact rules governing political activity of tax-exempt organizations. We haven't said what the percent of acceptable political activity should be, but we do feel strongly there needs to be more guidance. It needs to rely on the data, replicating CRP's own data analyses to tell them which nonprofits are bending or breaking the rules. This would avoid all questions of partisanship and more effectively catch discrepancies between political spending reported to the FEC versus what's reported to the IRS. For instance, we documented just this past April that scenario showing that the $1 million spent by the 501c4 Secure America Now on independent expenditures reported to the FEC was wildly different from the $124,000 they reported spending on politics to the IRS. And finally, the IRS should require e-filing of Form 990 so that they can be searchable and usable across the board. An alternative would be a combination of e-filing and manual work by the IRS, which is akin to what the FEC has been grappling with lack of Senate e-filing. But the ideal would be electronic filing across the board. And I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Tyler to talk about legislative proposals.
Thank you. So the way I like to think of this in terms of a solution context is kind of three conceptual buckets for how you approach the issue. The first one is changing, and there's a memo, I think, on people's chairs that goes into this a little bit more detail. The first one is changing who can spend dark money and how much money they can spend. The second conceptual bucket is trying to get at the actual disclosure of the donors behind the dark money groups. And the third bucket is, to the extent there is disclosure, making sure you have better methods of disclosure or effective methods of disclosure. There's sort of a third and a half bucket, which is, the best laws on the books are only as good as the agencies who are charged with enforcing them. As you've heard a couple times today, the FEC, not stellar reputation in that area. So I don't want to, having good policies and good laws is important, but no matter what you do, you're probably going to have to look at some sort of Federal Election Commission reform to make sure that we are really enforcing the laws in an appropriate and effective way. So the first conceptual bucket is the changing who can spend dark money or how much money they can spend. This is really kind of getting at the 49% rule in regards to 501c4 groups, which, as we've heard, are a very prominent source of dark money spending. As Sheila mentioned, this would theoretically be under the IRS purview. Not sure that they're going to touch it anytime soon. You could pass a law through Congress that would, say when we said exclusively, we really meant exclusively, not primarily. I think that's more likely route, frankly, than the agency route, but it's still it's a tough sell to the GOP. There's a contingent of members of Congress and senators who just don't like messing with IRS rules, and I would say that's an important effort to sort of see how far we can get, but there's probably better ways to get it. A pretty more direct route is simply the second conceptual bucket, which is if there's going to be spending, disclose the donors behind the groups that are spending that. This, I think, is a little bit more politically viable. We were at issue one in roughly 200 different congressional offices in the 115th Congress, and behind closed doors, we had a pretty common thread between from members of Congress and staff, both Republicans and Democrats, that they really don't like dark money. They don't like the fact that they're somewhat resigned to the fact that there's going to be outside spending, but what they hate is that a group can come in and dump millions of dollars on their race in the last month of the election, and they don't even know who it is. So it's sort of hard for them to fight back. This is a thread that we're hoping to seize on and capitalize in the 116th and beyond, because we think there is a real opportunity to make some meaningful change through Congress. There's a couple different approaches you can do it. I would say we probably have to do something more than just reintroduce the Disclose Act and hope for the best. We really need to actively cultivate bipartisan solutions to this issue. The Disclose Act, I think, is a good policy. It's smart, but it's not enough to kind of try the same thing again. I will point out that even if you have a good disclosure law, there's still an issue of you can call it the shell game or the daisy chain, which is you could always set up an LLC and fund the money through the LLC, and then the LLC is a donor or a second 501 entity. So if you're going to have meaningful disclosure, you really need to get at that transfer issue. I'm comfortable saying we've had discussions with this in congressional offices, and there's some real interest in doing something on this in legislative capacity. So, stay tuned on that. The third is the better methods of disclosure. Again, to the extent that you're going to have information disclosed, you want to make sure that it is useful and effective. This is an easier lift because it's kind of nipping around the edges, but if you just did anything in these categories, it wouldn't be a sort of a systematic solution. Bills I would put in this area are things like the Honest Ads Act, which is dealing largely with online spending. So the easiest way to summarize is that it takes the rules that apply to television ads in terms of political file disclosures and applies a very similar concept to online advertising. As there was a question earlier about the disclosure cliff, and I have friends who work in politics, and they sort of say, we can't get 18-year-olds to watch TV now. Imagine what it's going to be like in 10 years. Everything's moving online. So I think inevitably something's going to have to be done just to make sure you get the disclosure laws have to match the reality of political spending. It's moving online, it's moving away from broadcast television, and if you don't change the disclosure regime, you're going to be even more antiquated than we currently are.
All right. Thank you very much. I just want to again say thank you to the panelists here. I think what you're seeing is something that is somewhat unusual in Washington, which is organizations with very rich resources working together to make sure that those resources are available to the media and the public, and bringing our respective strengths, whether it's Sheila Krumholz's incredible knowledge about data and disclosure, to the legal knowledge that Adav has and the CLC, and then the work that Issue 1 is doing in trying to figure out how we actually make an impact in policy. So I want to thank especially our partners here, because this is what it takes to actually get something done in Washington. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. If you can just, again, identify yourself, because we are streaming this, and it helps those who are listening online. If you have any questions for our panelists about any of these solutions or other issues, we're happy to take them. Yes, Bill will be right there.
Hi, my name is Gustavo. I'm with End Citizens United, which does a lot of work here. So I have a sort of general question. I wish I could be more specific, but this is all just sort of forming as the 116th Congress gears up. There's been some discussion that because the Democrats have the majority in the House of Representatives, that you could see some action by changing the rules of the chamber itself. And that would go through House rules and whatnot. So I'd love to hear your guys' opinion and thoughts of what would be the best impact that we could make by changing the rules of the chamber and who's allowed to sit, and if they're if we can essentially sort of force disclosure in exchange for the privilege of sitting in the House of Representatives and things like that, because that seems like the most immediate avenue of attack on this front, at least in the immediate future.
Yeah, so I think you trying to use the House rules to make the system better is a really smart play, and definitely something the incoming majority should look at. The issue arises is that the House rules are by their very nature internal and can only bind members of the House and staff. We're talking about, dark money is inherently outside spending. So it's one of, I think that's something, it's a creative approach that needs to be explored further, but this is the one issue where it's really hard to do something. You could maybe talk about some sort of waiver provision like a conflict of interest, but when you get into that area, if you try to get into that territory, you basically run into a political problem where you're asking members to do something that's hard to enforce, difficult, and is a really heavy political lift, and so I just don't know that you could get them there. But I think it's a smart concept, and that should be explored fully, and certainly in other money and politics areas.
And if I could just add very quickly, not only it's a great idea, it doesn't reach outside spending, it also doesn't reach challengers, right? So you would have an asymmetry between sitting members running for re-election and their challengers.
Which, just to not to, I don't know, I assume we have House staff watching this or here. Members, if there's one thing they are loath to do, it's give anyone an advantage or themselves a disadvantage.
But I would note there are other aspects of the role that money or lobbying plays that I think could be done through House rules. And we've had some discussions with both Republicans and Democrats about what those other rules might be. This is one of the areas that maybe makes it, that would be a little bit more difficult to reach, but that doesn't mean there aren't other areas where the House rules could actually speak to everything from how parties allocate their chairmanships in committees to the role of lobbyist fundraising and many other things. So there are a lot of areas where the House or Senate rules could be used to address some of the worst pay to play that we see in the system. Next question. Yes.
Hi, Alan Zibble with Public Citizen. I'm going to ask the same question I was asked earlier because I asked it to the wrong panel. Is there anything that can specifically be done about the 4 outside money groups that seem to be very closely tied with the leadership organizations in the House and the Senate? I think 3 out of 4 are spent more than their PACs this cycle. And they have various kind of innocuous names: the Senate Majority PAC and Majority Forward and Congressional Leadership Fund, and there's one more I can't remember. But is there anything that can be done at the FEC or through litigation on those specific entities?
Well, there should be. I mean, it's illegal. So, the obvious coordination that's happening between those super PACs that are broadly referred to almost universally as the party super PACs, which is an oxymoron, that should be unlawful. But it would require FEC action or theoretically Department of Justice action to stop it. And given the current makeup of the FEC, it's unthinkable. I mean, the FEC is having trouble cracking down on egregious outside actors, much less their own party sponsors. It's very hard to see that happening.
And that's one of the reasons, actually, one of the bills that we've been working on is a bill that would actually try to deal with the fact that the FEC is a failed agency. And as I noted earlier, I was joking with Adav, he spent many years at the FEC, so he knows where he speaks. So, Ken? Is there a microphone? Oh, wait.
First of all, thank you for all you do for our democracy. It's really appreciated. My name is Bobby Littman. I'm with democracyisnotforsale.org. Your comments really intrigue me. You know, to protect the public around Halloween, there's a sex offender, registered sex offender registry, which gets circulated. It's a public document, and Nextdoor.com publishes it and others. And so you say to your kids, avoid that house, avoid that house. Could a similar registry be created for people who benefit from dark money, candidates, so that people, voters, can say, oh, in my area, these are the 12 people who are benefiting from dark money. Just like the sex offender registry, I don't send my kids to that house. I don't send my vote to that house.
There's been some research, Professor Abby Wood and others have done research that shows that it actually is meaningful to voters when a particular candidate is identified as being supported by dark money. Voters at the margins are less inclined to vote for such a candidate. So, I think there is a role to play both in the campaign process, but also for journalists to highlight when candidates are more or less affiliated with that sort of activity.
But I would also say there's been some other studies that showed when people were shown ads that were run by names with very anodyne, kind of Americans who love America, they were actually more persuasive than ads run by groups that were known names like the Sierra Club or the Chamber of Commerce. So it can cut both ways because people bring into those ads their own, prejudices. So it's not as straightforward as you might think. There was also a notion at one point that if you had stand by your ad language in ads, it would help reduce the number of negative ads. I never actually believed that, And I don't think that's actually been shown what's happening. Ken?
Could I just tag on one additional comment, and that is that would be further complicated this cycle in particular because of the spike in partially disclosing organizations. So we documented nearly 140 million spent by dark money organizations, but 406 million spent by partially disclosing organizations, which further muddies the waters and is, in some cases, I think, a vehicle for funneling dark money into those races. So it's not just dark money now, it's to a greater degree partially disclosing organizations.
Yeah, Ken Doyle with Bloomberg Government. Sorry. On the issue of the FEC, the role of the FEC, the backstop to the FEC is supposed to be this provision that says you can challenge FEC decisions in court. There's a lot of cases going on now, including the one that you mentioned. But is there just no hope of making that work either? Or how would that work? How could that work?
No, I think there is hope, and I mentioned in my opening remarks that I think the courts are one of the two avenues in which there is a meaningful chance of reform, because the laws are on the books already, and the FEC as an agency is required to follow existing law. It's not quite as straightforward as that makes it sound, though, because agencies get deference in what they choose to enforce or not enforce, and there are ways in which there are structural advantages for an agency to defend its inaction. But there's at least one major example recently of a successful lawsuit that made a difference, and I think there's a substantial likelihood that there could be more. Whether those court decisions could build up to the elimination or substantial reduction of dark money, I think is an open question, but it's certainly a possibility.
But do they have a chance of actually revealing who some of the donors to some of these groups are, any of these lawsuits, do you think? Isn't that the ultimate goal, at least in specific cases where the decisions on enforcement cases have been challenged? Do you think that will happen?
I mean, that's partially the goal, because these lawsuits involve particular fact patterns, but I'll speak for myself and my organization. We care much more about fixing the law going forward than we do about revealing who was behind certain spending in 2012. And some of these cases involve 2012 and 2014. So the mechanism for challenging the FEC's inaction is through challenging it in particular fact patterns, but that is a means to the end of fixing the law, not revealing those particular donors.
And I'll just add briefly to that. While litigation is an important tool in the toolbox, it's not great to sort of write regulations through litigation. It takes a long time. The courts are not experts on this stuff. So you don't want to rely on that. I use the word backstop, which I think is an appropriate sort of a word, but I think it's important for the reform community to think about, and our elected officials and the FEC, that you want to continue to improve the system just to make a better system. I mean, we're in such a hole right now that we're focused on digging out, but you want smart laws, you want smart regulations, you want a smart agency to try to make whatever disclosure system we had more user-friendly, more understandable by reporters and advocacy groups and the public. So don't sleep on the legislative and the regulatory fixes.
Thank you. Zach Montalero with Politico. Earlier this cycle, we saw a bunch of mailers come out that were sent to largely red states, promoting a third-party candidate. And that seems like a big problem in that the fact that there was no disclosure on it, but there's no enforcement mechanism behind this either. So even if all this change gets pushed forward, how do you improve the enforcement mechanism of the FEC? Even if these rules are on the books, what happens next?
We have a bill. There's a few, as we've criticized the FEC pretty roundly today, I think the two important things are that there's a structural issue and there's I won't say staff, there's a personnel issue. Having a 3-3 commission does not necessarily engender a nimble agency that can work on enforcement matters and work on regulations in a timely fashion. It's kind of designed to be gridlocked. Meredith has this fact better than I do, but I believe it was the House Majority Leader or the Minority Leader. In the 70s, when they were designing the commission, it was not originally conceptually an even number. And then a politician to kind of, put their thumb down and say, let's make this agency a little bit less effective, made it an even commission, so it would deadlock. And on top of that, you still need good commissioners on the commission who are interested in enforcing the law. That has been a problem, getting good folks through the Senate in, I don't know, what do you think of the last 15 years? I mean, it's been a long time, and we don't even have a full commission right now. And there's, I think, one nominee that's been nominated, and nothing's happened. He wasn't even put on the docket. And there's a lot to be done there, but you want to look at the structure of the commission, and you want to make sure that you have good nominees being nominated.
And I would add that the problem of anonymous mailers in political races is that is not a new issue. That's not a Citizens United issue. There's probably 200 years of history of that. The problem that's new, though, is that today, if somebody slapped the Americans for America label on it, and Americans for America is a 501c4 that got all its money from XYZ LLC in Delaware, that's the end. You're never going to know who paid for that mailer because there is no way the FEC will muster the necessary votes to commence an enforcement action.
And the modern day mailer, as we know, is not only what's going through the mail, it is what's going through Facebook and Twitter and all the other social media. And that's one of the reasons that we have worked so hard to try and think through and work particularly with the Campaign Legal Center and members up on the House and Senate side on the Honest Ads Act. But even then we know that that's only capturing a slice of these activities of paid political advertising. So if there's that room somewhere over in, I don't know, somebody told me one point Macedonia, where there are 100 people sitting in a room and they're naming themselves, "Hi, I'm Becky." And they're posting information on Facebook using this American-sounding name and reposting things. This is an absolute, it's not paid political advertising, but it is an attempt to provide disinformation and propaganda, not unlike what we've seen in the past. I recently heard a former CIA fellow talk about how if we don't understand that what's going on is a disinformation campaign, not only in America, but in Europe and other places around the world, to basically convince people that democracy as a way of governance is not working, then you're not understanding the game. If you get too caught up in, oh, was it pro-Trump or was it anti-Hillary? That's not the game. The game is to convince people that this system of government is too flawed to work. So trying to understand this dynamic about what's going on, whether it's an unpaid mailer or a paid mailer but you don't know the source, or whether that same activity is happening online, is the propaganda that's probably as old as time, but propaganda can be much more effective the more it's targeted, the more they understand it. So we have to understand as we look at politics, this is not about squelching speech, but it's ensuring that people know where that speech is coming from so they can make an assessment for themselves about how they want to respond to it. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sue Rin with ABC News. It seems like candidate campaigns and outside groups are pushing anti-coordination laws more and more recently. And in particular, my understanding is that the Trump campaign manager has been linked directly to an outside group, a pro-Trump super PAC and nonprofit. Is there no legal ground to challenge that, or is there any effort to challenge that at all?
There sure is. We've filed a formal complaint alleging that is unlawful coordination, and that as a result, the spending by the super PAC and the affiliated 501c4 are unlawful corporate contributions to the campaign. That complaint remains pending, and I suspect will for quite a while.
And again, to my point earlier about how it's not smart to pass laws through the courts, we're sort of in this situation with really bad coordination laws because the Supreme Court and Citizens United said this type of activity is permissible, but it can be disclosed. And then it can't be coordinated. And nothing happened. The FEC didn't change its rules. I mean, they did sort of, but not really. Congress didn't change the rules. So you have a concept of coordination that is outdated to begin with, isn't enforced already, and then you had actors who are just willing to push the envelope. So again, litigation important, but we want to take a look at the concept of those coordination laws to begin with, and I'll say we hope to have a bill on that at some point.
I was just going to add, that seems to me like one of the strongest platforms for reform, because the evidence flies so much in the face of common sense and applies across the political spectrum. When parents of candidates are setting up super PACs, independent super PACs on their behalf, when the top lieutenants of a campaign shift to the nominally independent outside groups that are solely focused on electing or defeating a candidate, it is easy to understand how far off the rails the system has gone, and it is something that causes outrage pretty quickly on the left and the right. So it seems like a great opportunity to foment potential change from the ground up.
They can go around in some closing remarks. And
Sure. While we wait for another question, if there's just one more point on coordination. If you read the law and the rules on coordination, it's quite strict. And the Supreme Court has cited that in other opinions, saying, look at these laws on the books. It's really hard to cheat. The problem is they're not enforced. And because the agency that is in charge of enforcing them just seizes on every excuse to not find that anybody has violated the law. And I know this was true recently. I think it's still true. There has not been a single case, not one case, since Citizens United where the FEC found a super PAC to have coordinated with a campaign. And that's extraordinary, right? Given the frequency with which it happens. Not once. The other avenue for fixing that is the Department of Justice. So criminal violations of campaign finance law can be prosecuted by the Department of Justice, separate and apart from anything the FEC might or might not do. And DOJ has brought a few criminal coordination cases, at least 2 or 3 in the last few years. Whether that will become a priority of the department and whether that would meaningfully affect behavior, I think it's too early to tell.
Well, I was just going to add that in terms of the IRS, the guidance that came out this summer that stripped away the name and address from the Schedule B for 501c4s and 6s, on the one hand, is really not that important because they didn't have to disclose that information on their public filing anyway. Members of Congress have argued that the change would protect taxpayers' identities and protect the IRS from improperly targeting particular organizations. But it is like, one more chink in the armor, or kind of constantly stripping away bits of information that occasionally leak out that are instructive in telling us that in the case of the Secure America Now 501c4, Bob Mercer was the top donor, giving $2 million to an organization that ran virulently anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant ads that he would not have been accountable for had there not been that inadvertent lapse. And there wouldn't have been that inadvertent lapse now because they no longer have to file that even to the IRS.
yeah, we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Woolert, also with Politico with Zach. There was a lot of talk on the campaign trail this year, and Citizens United was very active in condemning corporate PAC money. Corporate PACs aren't happy. It seems like that was the wrong target. I understand that maybe it was the only statement they could reasonably act on, candidates could reasonably act on, But my question is, the dark money and the soft money seems to be driven by individuals, it seems to me, and not by like giant corporate dollars. Is there any sense that you can get the business community to work with you? I mean, on some of these reforms? Like corporate PAC money is at least transparent, right?
Yes, there is a sense that we can get the business community to work with us. Much like anything, I think sometimes this issue gets boiled down into something that's a little bit simpler than reality. Business is not a monolith. They don't have an opinion. And one thing that we find when you talk to folks who are sort of not an integral part of the DC power and money game is that they're really frustrated. So, business owners who don't spend tons and tons of money on lobbyists or don't give tons of money for dark money ads, they kind of look around and say, like, those guys are getting a handout from the government. They're getting help up. Like, I'm just trying to run my business and do things the right way, and I'm getting, screwed. So the issue has always been tapping into that, and business leaders are small c conservative. There's some hesitation for them to sort of go out and take a stand, but it's a fertile ground for I think the advocacy community to work with.
And I think going back to the first panel, part of the answer for that is we don't know. Actually, it could be. I mean, and one of the largest dark money actors was the Chamber of Commerce, which I assume gets much of its money from business. So I don't think we can make that conclusion. The main conclusion we can make is we don't know where the money's coming from. And it could be, per usual in American politics, some amalgamation of corporations, individuals, labor unions. I mean, this is exactly the problem, is that we can't come to that. I would say in terms of the kind of pledge, as Tyler says, that was a proxy, right? It was a proxy term for saying we don't feel heard in Washington as average people. And whether that was Bernie Sanders, who ran with his messaging in 2016, Donald Trump, who talked about draining the swamp. What you see in 2018 is at least 12 states passed some kind of political reform measures, in some cases multiple political reform measures in those states. And there was, of all the places I think where it was robust political reforms were on the ballot, I think only one or two lost. So there is a definite pattern here of whether American people feel disconnected from their government, particularly from Washington. I think it's, when you look at what happened, I think it was in Michigan, I think it was a woman who won governor there, her motto was something like, fix the roads. It was not these big, enormous political questions, whatever, it was something very direct. And one of the challenges that the 116th Congress is going to face is you're going to have new members coming in from both parties, and are they going to be able to kind of get out of this? Some people talk about Trump derangement syndrome. I call it Washington derangement system. Are they going to be able to talk about issues that relate to the daily lives of American people and not kind of get caught up in these other issues? So I think the American people are very frustrated, and so that's why you saw this pledge have actually some resonance. I think that's why you saw Drain the Swamp have some resonance. And the question here for an American democracy, right, is what are the things we can do in this evolving process to try and make sure our government is as responsive and that members of Congress who get there actually get to do their jobs and represent their constituents. That's what we think about every day at Issue 1, is how can we make that system better? Never perfect. It is a more perfect union. We want to leave a little time afterwards so that people have specific questions, that you can have some time to come and talk to our panelists. I want to thank each and every one of them. They're experts in their field, and we also want to thank again the first panel and thank CRP for hosting us. I will say again, the reason we wanted to do this today is we spend a lot of time talking about the problems. We don't spend as much time talking about solutions. And the reality is there are solutions. Many people after Citizens United either said, oh, there's nothing to be done, or a constitutional amendment, and that's going to be so hard. We're here to say there's a lot of things that can be done. They're hard. They take political will. There's going to be political opposition. But the hard work of democracy is the everyday work where you try and sit down and say, how do we solve the problem? So I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll be happy to answer any other questions that you have. Thank you.